2024, an election year like no other. From the candidates to the issues, from voter integrity and analysis, we'll discuss debates, trends, patterns, election laws, and more. This is Vote 2024, Path to the Polls.
The 2024 political conventions are history. To say they were unconventional would be an understatement. The Republican National Convention was staged in Milwaukee in the shadow of an attempt to assassinate former President Donald Trump. Trump accepted the Republican presidential nomination before an enthusiastic crowd with a theme that was anything but typical for a Donald Trump speech: unity. Now, face it, for most politicians and at most conventions, that would be standard fare. But for the former president, that was a remarkable shift in tone, and it represented an intense image makeover by the GOP in just 4 short days. For about 14 minutes, he talked about his harrowing experience in Butler, Pennsylvania, where a would-be assassin missed delivering a deadly blow by a 1/4 of an inch because Trump turned his head. He said, "I heard a whizzing, loud sound and felt something hit me really, really hard on my right ear." He said, I said to myself, wow, what was that? It can only be a bullet. Trump said, "I'm not supposed to be here tonight." And the crowd chanted back, "Yes, you are." But that shift did not last long. The Donald quickly changed gears, went back on the attack, and stumped with his standard rhetoric, saying, under the current administration, we are a nation in decline, saying with our victory in November, the years of war, weakness, and chaos will be over. Yep, the RNC was an unconventional convention. And so too was the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. The political winds had blown long before conventioneers gathered in the Windy City. VP Kamala Harris and her running mate, Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota, were chosen as the party's nominees by virtual vote before the gathering. Of course, the Dems acted quickly because President Biden decided to drop out of the race. The tone at the Democratic gathering repeatedly described as electric and hopeful. In Chicago, to loud chants of "We love Joe," President Biden said, "I love the job, but I love my country more." All this talk about how I'm angry at all those people who said I should step down, that's not true, said Biden. I love my country more, and we need to preserve our democracy in 2024. The president joked that he was too young to begin work in the Senate, elected at 29, and too old to remain as president. The goal was a show of Democratic unity. Of course, there are still those who believe he was forced out, though Biden maintains the decision was his. On the nights that followed, there was a parade of stars preceding Kamala Harris and Tim Walz's big nights. You could almost quote the musical group Fleetwood Mac, "Don't stop thinking about tomorrow." There was a generational handoff of sorts, several of the party's aging figures acknowledging their twilight years and the emergence of new faces. Then, in her acceptance speech, the history-making candidate told what could best be described as grounded stories. Kamala Harris expanded and expounded upon the anti-Trump playbook. Oh yeah, there might have been magic in the air for the Dems, but former First Lady Michelle Obama perhaps said it best. There's a hard road ahead. Again, all this making for unconventional conventions. I'm Bruce Hamilton. Welcome to Path to the Polls. And joining me, my colleagues, News4JAX's political reporter and anchor, Scott Johnson, and producer Kenna Bear, both of whom reported on the conventions from Milwaukee and Chicago. Thanks, both of you, for being here.
Thank you, Bruce.
So, Scott, let's start with you. Politics, a very divisive issue these days. What was your biggest challenge in covering the 2024 conventions?
Well, it was interesting to be there for both. It was a different dynamic to where you went. When we went to Milwaukee, and we're going to talk about that a lot, the focus was on Trump and the assassination that happened 48 hours prior to the convention kicking off, maybe 36 hours. That was unprecedented. The Democratic issue, we were going in wondering at the convention, what's this protest situation going to be like on the Palestinian-Israeli issue? That was the focus. You can see some video there. We were wondering, how big is it going to get? Will it be disruptive? I will say, Bruce, it was big. We didn't see it where we were at. We were on the opposite side of the arena, and the only thing I can say is it did not impact the interior of the United Center. You did not see those protests, which were on the streets, as you can see there, spill into the United Center and really disrupt the televised convention, which is kind of what the Democratic Party was important to them, was getting their message out. That was not really interrupted. And if there were interruptions, they were minor and not anything really of note.
So Kenna works behind the scenes, by the way, and she works some of the magic in putting things together. This was your first foray on the road, covering political conventions and navigating the landscape, if you will. You hit the ground running with an idea of the stories that you wanted to get and the people you wanted to talk to. A lot of hurdles to jump as a producer. What was most fascinating for you in working behind the scenes?
Yeah, so really ours kind of came down to the logistics of things. That's how I focused and helped us get the stories. Scott was really, great about that. But mine was like making sure we get to the right places at the right times, who we're going to talk to when we get there. I will say, both parties, both conventions, we were able to get in touch with people and make some connections beforehand. What I would say is the RNC was a little bit harder to catch up with people. The DNC, it was a little more open. Every day they were just coming up and checking on us. Hey, do you want to talk? Do you have anything new you want to talk about? So that was kind of the biggest difference. The other thing we did notice on a logistics standpoint was kind of the crowds at each convention depended on the layout. So for the RNC, the kind of like side events were happening in kind of the same area as the arena. It was all walking distance. So we were able to see a lot bigger players a lot earlier in the day because they were all just there. When it came to the DNC, those side events were held about 20 minutes away from the actual United Center. So you really didn't get to see it fill out until kind of later in the day because it was just so split up. So that was kind of the biggest hurdle logistically, was being where you need to be for the big people. So.
Yeah, there are a lot of logistics to navigate, security and things like that. All right, so Scott, let's talk first about the Republican convention. It's staged against the backdrop of the Trump assassination attempt, and it totally, I have to imagine, changed the tone of that gathering. So the biggest takeaways for you, given that?
In every regard, the assassination attempt dominated that convention. I mean, literally 36 hours prior, we see this image prior to Donald Trump showing up at the convention. I cannot underscore how big of a deal was that going into Monday of the convention. That's what everyone's talking about. It totally blew up the entire plan. I don't say that casually. I just mean it just changed everything. The focus was on what had just happened in Pennsylvania. So that was the big focus. And then Monday, the question is, when are we going to see Donald Trump? No one knew. Trump, I'll just say I was working to get an interview with Donald Trump prior to the assassination attempt at the convention, and I'm sure other media outlets were as well. Obviously, though, Monday night we see this image, it's on your screen when everything changes. When I got word probably about an hour before we hear Trump has landed and he's here. And then we were live on the 10 o'clock news. Millions of people have watched Channel 4's coverage of this exact moment when Donald Trump walked out onto the stage with that square bandage on his ear, 48 hours after, about 50 hours after being shot. And the place was electric. It just was. That was a defining moment of this campaign. But yeah, everything changed for the party. The focus that they were probably going to focus on, immigration or the economy, the things that you would expect them to talk about, it was just overshadowed by the assassination attempt. That was the convention.
Kenna's job as an executive producer is planning, and you go in with a roadmap of things. So you go out to the convention, and basically you've got an idea of what you're going to do, and all of a sudden there's this assassination attempt, and the roadmap is just, you've got to take detours here and there. Your biggest takeaways, given the fact that you've got to re-navigate everything.
Yeah, and I will say though, it was pretty easy for us because I felt like every day a story kind of presented itself. We didn't have to, we weren't like digging for something because it was so electric, because this was a historic moment. So yeah, it really kind of came with us, it kind of came to us fairly easily.
Yeah. And working as a producer, you're used to, quick left turns, quick right turns, and quick changes. Guys,
I'm overlooking something. There was something else Monday that we didn't know that was unprecedented for a convention. We didn't know who Donald Trump's running mate was. So we found out Monday it's this J.D. Vance guy, and I'll be honest, just bluntly honest, I knew all the running mates like the back of my hand. I knew Marco Rubio. I knew Sarah Sanders out in Arkansas, and all the other ones that have been talked about. The only one I didn't know a ton about was J.D. Vance, and that's who they went with. So that was just a big issue when Vance, and we're just scrambling and absorbing everything we can about this guy from Ohio, who he is, what his story is. I'm hearing about this hillbilly elegy book he wrote. I'm finding out he's the youngest running mate ever. This is all just stuff we're learning and absorbing in real time. So that was the other big headline, who this Vance guy was.
So when you heard the name, what'd you think?
Well, what I thought was, I got to learn who he is. And then I saw one of the big things that I've heard a lot is the guy who endorsed him a lot. And I don't say this politically, people have opinions on this guy, was Donald Trump Jr. Donald Trump Jr., by most accounts, is the guy who championed the J.D. Vance. There was a lot of questions about Vance in the first week. I will say that's not a surprise. That's typical opposition research. Same thing happened with the Walls. When they pick the running mate, the opposition research is going to flood. And it did on Vance. And, he's weathering that now or in the general. But we were trying to absorb who this, I think, 39-year-old guy under the age of 40 with this unique background, talking about his hillbilly-like lifestyle, going on to the Ivy League. So, yeah, there was a lot to absorb on who this Vance guy was for not just us, but just the entire electorate as a whole.
And what's that tell you about his son's influence on Dad? Because there aren't many people who have that kind of influence.
And that's been a fascinating thing about the Trump family. That family is big. Like when we were at the Republican dinner in the morning, one of the interviews that I brought you here on News4Jax was Eric Trump, the other son. And that family, particularly Eric and Don Jr., are the ones that are really the kind of lieutenants or de facto spokesmembers. Ivanka seems to have pulled back a little in recent years. Yeah, you don't hear from her anymore. Same with Jared Kushner, but you do hear from the two sons. And I will point this out, it's a Jacksonville thing, which I think is important. Eric Trump spoke at the Florida convention. Eric Trump walks past all the local media and had no interest in talking to anyone. I don't say, that's just normal. A national, presidential family's not going to talk to the local media. He looks at me and goes, "Wait, who are you?" I said, "I'm from Jacksonville." If you're not aware, the entirety political apparatus of Donald Trump's campaign is headquartered in Jacksonville, Florida. And when they heard we were from Jacksonville, he's like, "Nope, I'm going to stop and we're going to chat." So Jacksonville was something that the Trump family immediately recognized and wanted to chat with us and let our viewers hear what they had to say.
Not what you know, but it's who you know.
It's who you know.
We also noticed, on the big stage, at the RNC, there were a lot of family members who spoke. There were a lot of, and they didn't necessarily all speak from we kind of usually see them talk to kind of humanize the person. Most of them were more political, they were more of a political focus rather than just, experiences with.
But eventually they did bring out Trump's granddaughter, which is one that people are talking about, and we'll talk about in a bit. Doug Emhoff did the same thing with Kamala Harris, the second gentleman, coming out and talking about what she's like as a person. There is that push on both parties to show Donald Trump and Kamala Harris not as the political stereotype. Humanize them, make them relatable, and there was that effort too.
Well, and that's important because we see them, on the political stage, and we see them in debates, and we see them at the rallies and things like that. They do have a family life, and I've got to believe, regardless of what you think of them politically, that they are very different, when, they're in their personal quarters and things like that.
Which is why I think that granddaughter speech was a big one for Trump. Because everyone has an opinion on Donald Trump. He's a bull in a china shop no matter what side of the aisle you're on. But to hear from a granddaughter talk about grandpa, that was an issue. That was something we've never really heard before.
And we saw a different side of him, too, after that attempt. So the night President Trump spoke, what struck you the most when it came to the reaction? Because for the first 12 to 15 minutes, it was an entirely different side of Donald Trump before he went into the rhetoric.
I will say, First off, he was long. I mean, I've heard both sides of the aisle. Republican supporters, obviously Democrats are going to say it was, what it was, but Republicans, they were like, he was a little long. But yeah, the first 15 minutes was really about that. Just say, hey, to my supporters, I'm lucky to be alive. and really his first chance to talk to them. Then, of course, he goes into policy for a long, long time. I think he spoke, was it like 60, 90 minutes or something like that?
About an hour and a half.
Yeah, it was a long, long speech. But yeah, and I think he probably wanted to get a lot off his chest because he'd been pretty silent. I mean, that was one thing that was interesting about the campaign. He didn't say a word to anyone up until that Thursday night speech. We didn't hear from him. He didn't do interviews, didn't call in on any shows, no network, no Fox News, nothing like that. We did not hear from Donald Trump.
Which is unusual for Donald Trump.
Which is unusual. He is very everywhere, but he wasn't that week. He was very disciplined. He did not speak until his speech.
You know, a producer's job is to hear things behind the scenes. So after the assassination attempt, I mean, did you hear anything that was unusual that, you know, made you go, whoa?
You know, not really. I think a few times you know, were getting sources of like, you were like, oh, is he gonna, just like you said, is he gonna talk to this news outlet? Is he gonna talk to that news outlet? You know, it was a lot of anticipation of when we were gonna hear from him for the first time. I would say that was probably the biggest thing.
Yeah.
After the
and I believe, if my sources are correct, I'm going on memory because about a month ago, I want to say the original plan was for him to not show up till a couple days in, but he made the decision, no, I need to show up, I need to be visible that I'm okay on that first night, which has really pushed up his appearance at the convention.
I was a little surprised. I would imagine that his advisors probably said to him, let's just kind of lay back a little bit, show the softer side of Donald Trump here, and then he became Donald Trump.
Yeah, and I will say one thing. There was a lot of questions that Kent Justice and Joey Purdy were asking me on the news. They're like, Scott, what's security like? Because there was think of what it was like. I mean, 48 hours prior in Pennsylvania, he's getting shot at an open field. So they're like, could he get shot? Were there guns? You know, how many police are around? That wasn't really relevant. I mean, to even get here to where he was speaking, you had to go through layers of security. It's not like what we saw in Pennsylvania, which a lot of people are questioning and saying, how did that gunman get there? It wasn't like that, and it was locked down. And an interesting thing, Bruce, remember when we almost had the political convention, the Republican National Convention in Jacksonville 4 years ago, and Sheriff Mike Williams says, we can't do that in a few weeks? I could see why. When we were there, like that, you bring in police from multiple states, you bring in all the federal agencies. There was a massive amount of planning. And when then Mayor Lenny Curry said, come to Jacksonville, I understand why his right-hand man, Mike Williams, says, we can't pull that off.
No, it's not that. I've covered a number of political conventions in my career. No, it takes a lot of planning. You were gonna say something.
At the RNC, there was a time where I was trying to get to our car and figure out parking, and we were going through all of this drama. And I was walking up to all of these different police officers, and they're all from different states. And they're like, I have no idea where we are. You know, they're just here for security. So, you know, it was like Pennsylvania, Illinois, Iowa, you know, I mean, you name it, like there were different police officers there. And so it was kind of a pain to find things. But we noticed in Chicago, it was very different. And we kind of had this discussion. It was really all Chicago PD. And we were talking about how they really have to, in general, like everyday life, they really have to have their own force as it is. You know?
And I will say, to even get to this facility, they put up fencing, which we can, I mean, in the Palestinian issue in the Chicago, they did cut a little fencing, but for the most part, it was a tiny bit of fencing. I mean, to even get within blocks, you have to go through hardened fencing and armed guards to even get within blocks. It's not like I'm walking up and then I have to go through security once I get to the venue. No, to get blocks away, you have to go through hardened fencing.
And I got to wonder a lot if there hadn't been that attempt, if the security would not have been as tight as it was.
No, they asked that, and they said it absolutely would have been. Their plans never changed. So that was a big question we asked the first day.
So let me ask you on a little lighter note. You've got your Going Ringside podcast. Hulk Hogan was there. Did you try and get him?
I did. So she had to live with me going out. He wasn't the only famous wrestler there. I got Vince McMahon's wife and others. And I forced them, like, we're going after these people. So the final night, I didn't know Hulk Hogan was going to speak. And I do want to say something after this. I did 3 laps around the arena and blew my knee out trying to find him. I was unsuccessful. I will say this. A year ago, I sent a proposal to the Trump campaign to come on Going Ringside for him to talk about his wrestling past. And I mentioned I wanted to see how you talk about, you hang out with guys like Dana White with UFC, Hulk Hogan, Kid Rock, and the McMahons.
I remember you telling me about this.
Do you know who the speakers were the final night? Hulk Hogan, Kid Rock, Dana White, and the McMahons. I still want my royalty check for the idea.
Did you say, do you know who I am?
I tried it. It only got me so far.
We joked that he was going to be on a watch list because of the way he ran down Linda McMahon.
Linda McMahon, who's the former head of the Small Business Administration, Vince McMahon's wife, who's in Trump's cabinet. I see her. Big interview for Going Ringside. You can go see it now. No one ever gets her. It's like an impossible interview. So I freak out, and I'm like looking behind fences. Where's she at? I didn't realize the Trump family was back there. So all these Secret Service guys, plainclothes, are like looking, who is this guy? What's going on? Fortunately, we got the interview. So that happened too. I was not on a watch list.
Is that, it's online right now, right?
It's online. You can watch Linda McMahon's interview from RNC right now.
When Path to the Polls continues, we travel the road from Milwaukee to Chicago, continue to talk with Scott and Kenna about their experiences behind the scenes at the Democratic National Convention. Stay with us. More Path to the Polls to come when we come back. Welcome back. Watching Path to the Polls. Bruce Hamilton with my guests and my fellow colleagues, Newsmax political reporter and anchor Scott Johnson and executive producer Kenna Bear, both at both conventions. Started off talking about the RNC. Now we focus on the behind-the-scenes experiences at another unconventional convention, the Democratic gathering in Chicago. So, Scott, what made this convention unconventional was that a sitting president decided to abruptly sit out the 2024 race at virtually the last minute, opening the door for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz to walk in. Kind of interesting to note that things went abruptly from Joe Biden, you can't win the White House, to a rousing chance of we love Joe on the convention floor.
It was absolutely that. The story of the first night was Joe Biden, and having him come out and speak, and essentially the party saying thank you to him for his service and thank you for his decision to step aside. The party has kind of been unified in trying to thank him for that. Is there frustration behind the scenes? I don't know. People speculate, but the public tone of the first night was saying thank you to Joe Biden. and having him give his big speech, and then moving the party forward from there. But I saw different kind of themes throughout the week, and I don't mean the actual legit themes that they titled it, but the story. The story at the beginning was Biden and Biden's decision to step down, Biden addressing his party, saying he put party above himself and decided he needed to withdraw for the benefit of his party. I think you said at the top of the show something along the lines of, I'm too young for Senate, but too old for president, something like that. But yeah, there was a lot of vibe of thanking Biden for what he'd done. And I want to point out one thing. There was some mischaracterizing of this on the first night. There were a lot of the public discourse is on X, formerly Twitter. There were a lot of images shown of empty seats, which is not what you're seeing there at the United Center. It was not representative. That was the very first day, first few hours of the first night. But by prime time, every night, that United Center was packed.
Before you go and say what you want to say, I do want to point out that the person who is responsible for Twitter has their own political agenda. And you can take that as you will. Go ahead, Kenna.
I was going to say, in fact, on the last night of the DNC, Scott couldn't get in to the United Center because the fire marshal basically said, you've got to stop letting people into the United Center.
And the first people to go were journalists.
Yeah.
Good, you were going to. Oh, that's
but
what
that
you were
was it,
yeah. Did you notice, Kenna, a big difference in tone in Chicago than Milwaukee?
I did. I would say, the RNC and in Milwaukee was very focused on Trump and very focused, and we did just see an assassination attempt. So it was kind of like a, kind of a scary moment for his supporters. And there was a lot of backing for him. At the DNC, I would say it felt maybe a little more, the tone and the message was a little more like a united kind of front. Yes, they were happy that, they have Kamala Harris now leading, and they, as Scott just said, really thanked Joe Biden for, stepping aside. But really it was less about, I would say what I saw was less about Harris and more about their goals and where they want to go in the future,
Bruce, the only thing I would say that was different was more about physical environment as opposed to mood. To put it in Jacksonville terms, the DNC was physically crammed. There were thousands of people packed into this arena, nothing really on the outside, possibly because of the protests. It was packed. It was the equivalent of if they did a convention at Everbank Stadium downtown, but nothing out in the parking lot. So it was kind of crammed. The RNC was kind of felt to me like the Jacksonville Landing during its heyday. You walk out front and it's open and there's restaurants. So that wasn't really a political thing. That was just structurally, physically where they were at. The facility in Chicago was different than the facility in Milwaukee. It was more packed in Chicago, not as packed in Milwaukee.
Mm-hmm. What was the biggest challenge for you, Scott, in covering the conventions?
One of the and this is just a reality of what we deal with, not important to viewers, is just the physical amount of walking and carrying, because you can't bring a car in, and you got to walk from here to there, and everywhere you go is a half mile, and you're carrying equipment with you. So that's physically hard. And one of the challenges is, and I think it's a challenge for delegates who go to these things, you get all these credentials handed to you to go through security, go here. You can go here, but you can't go there. You can go there, but you can't go here. It's just confusing. There's a point to it. It's for security. I understand that. And to make sure that, certain people aren't mobbed. That makes sense, but it can be a little overwhelming trying to navigate where we're going. In fact, both conventions, the first day, all we did was sit and try and just navigate where we were at and where we were going.
Did you find any big challenges in covering the convention because of what had happened with Donald Trump and the assassination attempt just before the start of the RNC?
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that there were challenges related to that. It's kind of an overall, I would say, feeling.
Just because it's so big, it's so political. Yeah.
And also, at the RNC, we had different colored lanyards. So we would have this bright yellow lanyard that was very much like, hey, we're press. And so for the DNC, we didn't have that. So it just felt, I would say the DNC, maybe we were able to blend in a little more and not just be like, hey, we're press, that was the only thing that was that I did notice was a little difficult, because you kind of walk somewhere and people are like.
And I would say we had one hurdle at DNC we didn't have at RNC. During the week we were at DNC, there was an election in Florida. So one of our 4 nights where in general at RNC we were focused on the RNC, we had split focus. I mean, we were having here at News4Jax election specials all night on news4jax.com for the primary. So our day was we were kind of locked into our election coverage, which is just the reality of the world. It just is what it is. So that was an added hurdle that this was happening because RNC was just happening during a regular old week in the year. DNC, and that meant something for all the politicians and the Florida people who were there. They were all sitting there watching. And when I was talking to Democratic Party Chair Nikki Fried, who ran for governor here in Florida, her big focus Wednesday morning was what we did the night before. She was very enthused. She saw progress in school board races and other races around the state. So that was a big storyline for Floridians, what happened in Florida while we were in Chicago.
Yeah.
And I'd like to add to that really quickly. Something that I did think was interesting that Nikki talked about was some of the local races. She wasn't, they didn't turn blue. I feel like she knew they weren't going to turn blue. But her big thing was that it was more moderate candidates who had been elected. And so there were people that she said that she felt that her party could work with and that, different people could work with rather than, as she called them, extremists.
You're talking about some of the school board races.
And in St. Johns County.
St. Johns County, where
some of the
it's deep
commissioner
red,
races.
they were more moderate.
Yeah.
I want to point out one other thing, and I ignored this, and it's important for both conventions. You saw the importance of Florida and Georgia there. So let me start with the Florida. Every morning we would go to breakfasts for the different delegations. We would go to Florida mostly, and the amount of guests they would throw out the state of Florida.
Big names.
Big names. First day at the DNC, we're seeing the governor of Pennsylvania, we're seeing the governor of Illinois, and the governor of Michigan.
And Governor of Pennsylvania was a name that was prominently mentioned as a VP candidate.
Well, frankly, all 3 were Gretchen Whitmer to a point, as well as J.B. Pritzker. And that's the first 3 days. And I'm going to say something I'm really frustrated about. So every morning we were like, do we go to Florida or do we go to Georgia? Georgia's honestly probably more of the swing state than Florida is. But the day we didn't go to Georgia, I found out after the convention, the rapper Lil Jon was there, and because he introduced the Georgia delegation on the floor, I think Tuesday night, and I wanted to get him for ringside. It's kind of a similar demographic. I was really disappointed we didn't get Lil Jon at the Georgia convention.
There's still time.
Yeah.
Maybe not at the convention, but also.
In the future, yeah.
Scott, for Kamala Harris, it was perhaps the biggest political speech of her career. And I asked this about Donald Trump's speech, and I'll ask about the vice president's. How do you think it came across? Did it resonate?
It was very policy driven. And people debate that, but she seemed to be very serious. One of the sub-headlines, and there was a lot of drama, there was talk, it was frankly reported as fact that Beyonce was supposed to be there. Beyonce never showed up. So what I heard from Democratic sources with the Harris campaign was they didn't want to distract from her message, her talking to the American people about how she views this race. And I mean, she talked about everything from abortion to the Israel-Hamas conflict. I think she talked a little about democracy issues. So they didn't want to distract from her speech. And they felt if you bring in a Beyonce, it would have done that.
Mm-hmm. It was all about Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
And something else that I noticed is, really any politician that we cover, I feel, is always a little bit late or very late. She was right on the dot, right at 10:30. Walking out
Which
for
was
that
not
speech.
the case for a lot of other big speakers.
Yeah. It was very interesting because I thought, they were like, this is, obviously the biggest name we've got tonight or of this convention, and they really put it out there. And she also was very, even though she hit all of those points, she was very concise. She would say like a few sentences on one thing, move on to the next. So she was very much just on it.
It's the attorney in her.
And,
Yeah.
and one thing I noticed, stagecraft and who was and wasn't there at certain times. Let's start with the RNC. Trump family was there, DeSantis was there, other governors there. You know who wasn't there? Any member of the Bush family, any member of the Cheney family.
Were you surprised by that? Because I'm not.
I was the Bush a little more than the Cheney. I was not surprised the Cheney family wasn't there.
I wasn't surprised the Bush
Liz
family.
Cheney has not been involved, and obviously many people credit the demise of former Governor Jeb Bush to what happened in 2016 with him and Trump. So I wasn't totally shocked. I knew the Cheneys wouldn't show up, but I noticed it was Romney also not there. Also, like people like Paul Ryan not there. So there is that wing of the establishment of the party.
There's been political acrimony between the Bushes and the Romneys and the Trumps.
And then on the flip side, and this is speculation on a lot of people's parts, and no one really knows the answer. I'll just say it out there that it's speculation. When the Obamas spoke on Tuesday night, Joe Biden was in California, Kamala Harris was in Wisconsin. People were noticing that and wondering, like you see in the Republican side, is there any acrimony? Because there's been a lot of upheaval on the Democratic side. These are things that people talk about and notice who watch politics.
Look, if you listen to and you read the political pundits, they'll tell you that there's a lot of political veneer that's going on. That Joe Biden's not happy, that the speech that he gave, it was as political in nature as it could be.
Yeah.
That what you heard from the Obamas was as political in nature as could be.
And I'll say this, it was a rumor. Former CNN anchor, no matter what you think of, Don Lemon, was one of the ones big pushing it. And I was like, oh my God, is this real? There was speculation that George W. Bush would theoretically speak at the Democratic National Convention. This is the buzz
Could you
around
imagine?
the United States. Oh my God, that would have been, I don't mean to mince words, but that would have been huge. Let me just say that. However, I was watching this because I was like, that's a big deal if that's, like, that is a huge deal. Bush's spokesperson says, absolutely not, that's false. He would never do that. And then on the same token, Mitt Romney put a little more tongue-in-cheek post on X. He goes, I know you're all disappointed. You only get to see someone like a Beyonce or Taylor Swift, but I will not be appearing at the Democratic National Convention.
Well, there are all sorts of rumors about Taylor Swift these days.
Yeah, none of those names showed up. But yeah, that was a buzz. Like if the Democrats were able to get someone to flip.
There were a few that were still big names, even though that would have been crazy.
Yeah.
That was something that we did see at the DNC, and I apologize, his name is...
Adam Kinzinger?
Well, him as well. I was thinking the Lieutenant Governor of Georgia. Previous.
Yes, and on the flip, yes, that's right. So they got some of those, and the Republicans at the same side also got, I can't remember which union it was, they got a union boss there.
And Amber Rose was
And
another
Amber
one.
Rose.
From the UAW? That
Yeah,
union boss?
I think it was that one.
And Adam Kinzinger, he's a Republican he's like,
Right.
I'm
I mean, he was
Democrat.
on the January 6th committee.
Right.
Yeah.
But you saw both parties. Amber Rose was actually a very important one because it hit a demo who doesn't watch political conventions. Like, that's really important.
And her backing Trump.
And so with some of these politicians these days, the R&D labels don't necessarily mean what they used to.
Yeah. So it's just fascinating to watch the dynamics of who's backing who. And at the very top of the party, is there unhappiness? You could argue on both sides.
Oh, there's unhappiness.
Yeah.
I'm Joe Biden doesn't want to be going.
He made that clear prior to the letter that was
Right.
sent when he dropped out.
And he was being purely political in the comments that he made. He was being
he
true
did
to his
he
party.
did an interview
That's
with George Stephanopoulos on ABC like a week and a half before he dropped out, saying, I'm not going anywhere. A week and a half later, he did.
We're not going anywhere. Nothing political about that. When Path to the Polls continues, did the conventions, the speeches, the platforms that were laid out change any minds on the road to the Oval Office? We'll see what Scott and Kenna think coming up here. Path to the Polls when it continues. Conventions are now in the history books. Candidates are back on the campaign trail, hoping that what they did at their respective conventions helped pave the way to the Oval Office. No doubt the 2024 conventions, Democratic and Republican alike, were unconventional. And that's been our theme here on this edition of Pass to the Polls with my colleagues and guests, News4JAX political reporter and anchor Scott Johnson and executive producer Kenna Bear. You know, in many ways, these conventions are perfunctory. So have the candidates accepted their respective nominations after they've accepted those nominations and laid out the party platforms and moved on to the campaign trail? It's going to be interesting to see what happens next. And the next big event happens to be the debate that's coming up. Scott, do you think that what the public saw may have changed any minds? Because the polls are very close.
I don't know that they did, and I will say this. I think the opposing party sunk each other's convention. And here's what I mean by that. Do you know what happened the day after the RNC? Joe Biden dropped out of the race, and the entire oxygen for the RNC was immediate. The country's focus changed on a dime. And it's just reality. No one immediately the next day was talking about the RNC. They were talking about this massive bombshell. Joe Biden had just dropped out.
That timing was not an accident.
Timing was not. I have heard some reports that Biden may have wanted to do it the week before. However, the assassination attempt stopped everything. That's been some reporting. It's hard to know without.
Timing is everything.
Timing is everything. Either way, the storyline of the RNC changed the next day. The exact same thing happened a month later. The day after the DNC, Donald Trump is in Arizona with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., shaking up this race, taking that third-party insurgent former Democrat who was possibly going to get like 4 or 5% of the votes and say, he's now on my team. That immediately after the DNC, the National Press Corps started focusing on this news storyline. Both parties, and I think I heard the reporting, Trump saw what happened with Biden the day after his convention. He's like, I want to do the same thing to them.
And you know what? We're in a business where when it comes to politics, you kind of expect the same old. Did you see anything from your perspective that, you know, maybe the electorate's like, all right, things are being shaken up. We want to hear something different when it comes to the debates. We don't want the same old. You know, get down to policy. Quit with the veneer. Quit with the axe.
Oh, well, see, I was just about to say, I feel like things are getting shaken up by bringing in people that are not as policy. Like when Hulk Hogan came out, that was like probably the most cheers and like most reaction we saw, other than when Trump, came out.
Yeah, I got something to say on that. Go ahead.
But I do want to go back to the other question really quickly. I think what was interesting for the DNC was that they were very big on focusing on independence. They were big on like, if you don't feel like you have a space when you're voting, come to us. We're the more moderate one. So maybe that will have a difference for people who aren't sure how they're going to vote. But other than that, I don't think it really changed anyone's minds. They know which way they're going to go probably
I think
in November.
people are tired of the same old. I would like to think that they are.
Yeah. I want to talk about reactions. She mentioned Hulk Hogan. Obviously, that's my thing, because I host the show, but that's not why I'm saying this. I'm outside the arena when Hulk Hogan comes out to speak. There are hundreds of cops all over. They could care less about what's on the screens being plastered all over the convention. They're watching nothing.
They want Terry.
He walks out, they all dart for whatever monitor they can find, and everyone's staring at the monitor. That being said, a month later, I am in a booth. We're doing some stuff with CNN, and I'm in the booth with a bunch of TV people who don't care. They're just looking at their computers or looking at their phones. Well, there's speakers up there, the governor of wherever, the senator from wherever. But when Oprah Winfrey came out, they all jumped out of their seats. They're taking pictures. So star power still matters at these things. It's a nice break from the rigmarole of a senator from wherever putting you to sleep with policy things. It's still a TV production, and they still need people to want to watch it who are not care a lot about politics, because that's a lot of people. It's not just people like us who sit and eat and ingest this stuff every day. And putting in Hulk Hogan and an Oprah, it gets that.
So if you could get any one interview from the convention, Hulk Hogan?
Excluding the candidates, I'd say the Hulk. Yes. For me, that would be mine.
And you, Kenna?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I loved Oprah. Would have loved to talk to her. Oh, and the Obamas. That would have been great.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm kind of embarrassed to say who I wanted to talk to from the RNC. So,
Don't be.
Savannah Chrisley from the Chrisleys Know Best.
Oh, that's nothing wrong with that at all. There's nothing wrong with that at all.
She came up there, our former assistant news director. She and I would always like talk about her and like their family and just kind of like gossip about all of that. So when she went out there, I was like, oh my gosh. You know, that was the one. I know that sounds dumb. That was kind of a small one, but that one was the one that I was kind of like starstruck by because we accidentally we walked by each other, and so I was like, oh, should I get a picture? Should I go talk to her? But it didn't. So
you had the same thing when she saw Michael Cohen.
Yes, I did see Michael.
She's like,
Cohen
oh my God, Michael
DNC.
Cohen's here.
Yeah, so I was running to the restroom, and I, you know, like actually like bumped into his security guy, and turned and looked and realized, oh, that's Michael Cohen. And he was kind of standing over to the side while his security was talking to a police officer. And I was like, should I go talk to him? Like, I'm thinking in my mind, I'm like, should I go talk to him? Should I go introduce myself? But I had no idea what I would say.
And real quickly, on my Nancy Pelosi interview, finally found Pelosi the final night. We run up on her with camera. I get one question out, she gives me one answer. Some random guy, because she's still walking, so I'm walking with her, some random guy walks and just like bumps into me. And I lost the rest of the interview. I was like so frustrated. I'm like, he's like, oh, sorry, buddy, did I interrupt you? I'm like, yeah, you kind of did. You kind of did.
You'd be surprised. You know, we get to interview some fascinating people. I remember I covered a convention one year, and you know, someone says, oh, you know, who's the most interesting person you talked to? And I said, oh, I did some of these funny. Well, what was your favorite thing? I said, oh, I'm in the men's restroom, and Tom Brokaw was like right next to me at the urinal.
Yeah.
It's like,
we had Lester Holt was broadcasting next to us all week.
There you go. Yeah. Scott, want to end with a funny little aside? You wouldn't believe some of the things we talk about in the newsroom.
Funny little aside. It's not funny, but I will say this.
Or interesting.
So this is interesting. We didn't see the protests in Chicago. I was kind of fascinated by that. They kept it, there's sides to this arena. We were on the side where there were no protests. I was really surprised that we came across it a little on the final night, but it was pretty massive. I mean, there were thousands of people. We just didn't see it. Not that it didn't happen, we just didn't physically see it.
And I think they probably tried to isolate it from most of the people.
They did.
Most fascinating thing for you, Kenna?
Oh man, the thing that I thought was most fascinating really was just the support, you know, from both sides. You know, you have these people and they are so invested in this election and in these candidates, yes, in the process. You know, at the RNC, we saw more kind of like local lawmakers, commissioners, things like that. And really at the DNC, it was more like volunteers and just people who are invested in this. And so on both sides, I really admired like how much like drive there is for both of them, you know, when it comes to their candidates and how much they support them. So I think that was like the best part of it.
That's good to know because, you know, we think there's so much apathy in the country these days to know that they are invested in it and they realize that there's so much at stake. Yeah. Scott, Kenna, thanks so much. Appreciate it. Because you've given us a behind-the-scenes look at what goes into, you know, covering something this massive. And we do understand what's at stake because it is the nation's future, regardless of who you support. So thanks very much for this interesting edition of Path to the Polls. It gives you a behind-the-scenes look at, you know, what they do in covering those conventions. So remember, it's incumbent upon you to decide what happens in this nation when you go ahead and vote. Thanks for joining us on this edition of Path to the Polls. You can watch it again if you want on the News4Jax YouTube channel and news4jax.com. If you'd like to weigh in, you can reach us via email. Thanks for watching.
See why every day more people are choosing News4Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.